All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. And welcome to the third episode of the Islands Trust Alliance peer learning series. As a context, this series was created by the Alliance as a space for conservation trust funds working in island and coastal contexts to learn directly from each other's experience, not only what works, but also the institutional challenges behind the scenes. And as my disclaimer, every episode, these sessions are not designed as are designed as peer learning spaces, and I really want to encourage your active participation in the discussion, and you have ample opportunity to do so. You've already seen this in the first two sessions where we examined innovative finance mechanisms in Belize and practical implementation experiences across the broader Caribbean. Today, we're going to zoom out a bit slightly, however, to examine something that many of our members are grappling with. How do regional initiatives in SIDS move from political commitments to durable long-term action? And the potential role of CTFs in that regard. So, as many of you know, regional ambition in SIDS is often strong, whether on marine protection, blue economies, or climate resilience. But sustaining these initiatives over time is a challenge. It requires institutions, partnerships, and financing mechanisms that can outlast political cycles. So, and we have found, especially for CTFs, it says that increasingly as they are drawn or come out of these grand regional political visions, conservation trust funds find themselves playing roles that go far beyond simply dispersing grants. They are the conveners, the fiduciary anchors, and in some cases, the long-term stewards of these commitments. So that's what today's session is trying to tackle and try to draw those common themes of. So instead of formal presentations, we'll be having a moderated dialogue. We're going to hear short provocations from three regional perspectives. In the Caribbean, we'll hear from Karen McDonald-Gale. She's the CEO of the CBF, Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, and she will speak on how CBF is supporting Actioning Blue, which is a 30 by 30 vision and roadmap for the Caribbean Sea, framed as an urgent call to action by Caribbean political leaders. From the Pacific, or more specifically the Micronesia region, we'll be hearing from May Bruton Adams, who is the CEO of MCT, Micronesia Conservation Trust. MCT and CBF are like the wise elders in our growing alliance of SIDS conservation trust funds, but not their CEOs. Karen and me are as young and vivacious as ever. But yes, NCT is celebrating their 20th anniversary this year, and like CVF, is born out of a moment of great regional solidarity and ambition in the Micronesia region, which was the Micronesia Challenge. And 20 years later, they continue to be a bastion in the region for holding these ambitions together, growing them, and ensuring that they do not waver. So May joins us today to share specifically on a new regional initiative that MCT is pioneering, which is Micronesia. We would have shared a little two-pager in advance of this call about Ecofin Micronesia. And then finally, our last panelist, last but not least, is from the East region and wears many hats. This is Angelique Bono, is the lead negotiator on negotiations for AOSIS, and she's also a trustee of the Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association, WIOMSA. Um, WIOMSA is currently exploring the design of a regional conservation trust fund model for the Western Indian Ocean region, and they are drawing on examples from other SIDS regions such as the CDF. And Angelique will talk a little bit about how that process has been going, what they have learned, and ultimately the direction that they think they'll go to in terms of implementation. So as you see, these speakers cover the full gamut of different stages of institutional maturity, from well-established mechanisms to emerging regional designs. And the goal is not to compare which is best, but to understand what institutional choices seem to matter the most over time. So let's get straight into it. Um, I've asked each speaker to briefly reflect on how the initiative moved from political ambition toward institutional delivery and how trust funds have, or in the case of Angelique, can be designed from the outset to help anchor that process. So we're going to start with Karen and Action in Blue, which represents a significant regional effort in the Caribbean to translate blue economy ambition into practical financing and partnerships. So my initial question to you, Karen, is what conditions made it possible to move from political ambition to a structured regional initiative like Action in Blue? And where has the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund added the greatest value in supporting that process? Floor is yours, Karen.
Thanks, Jabal. And when I have my lineup of my three program managers, I refer to my Caribbean queens. And so I don't know what the equivalent here is, but very nice to be in the lineup with strong ladies from across the globe, and of course island partners. In terms of what political ambition has moved the action in blue forward, I think maybe a step back on the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund is probably worthwhile, and we are a byproduct, as I call it, of the Caribbean Challenge Initiative, which was the original idea of the first round of protected area management, which was 20 by 20. And that was to protect 20% marine protected areas by 2020. And the idea of the CBF was that we were to be created to facilitate the sustainable financing for that 20 by 20 goal. So as you all remember, 2020 was COVID. We reached some of our targets, and the idea really is we needed to reach more. What we found, that was very heavily driven by governments, regional governments across the Caribbean, led by governments of Grenada, Jamaica, and 8 others that were the original partners. So when it came to 2030, it was a very interesting and different space. CBF existed, and of course the countries were still there, and indeed there was somewhat of our legacy as being coming out of the 20 by 20 that we needed to do to play a role in what happens with 30 by 30. But also I would say in spaces where, to be quite honest, the governments were not moving as fast, CBF saw a place for it in helping to push the dialogue on 30 by 30. And we hope that that's been helpful. Right now we are at, I think we had Belize sign last week or 2 weeks ago, and we're now at, I think, 9 signatures. So we are working towards at least getting the verbal agreement that this needs to move forward. I would say there are also pros and cons in that process. It is in a country and a culture and a region where intergovernmental agencies and ambition has led the show until now. It's an interesting space for us to now say, as CBF, can you come on board? But I will say we've gotten mostly positive responses. We have seen an interesting mix of some saying we'll wait until our members, which are the governments, come to us, and others very much signing up. Particularly in the Caribbean region, there is also a subset of Eastern Caribbean states, and they have their own intergovernmental agency, which has been very, very involved in blue economy efforts and work, and they have signed on. And indeed, they have been a very strong partner with CBF on pushing forward the 30 by 30 and Action in Blue initiative. In the wider Caribbean, it is still a discussion with the CARICOM community who we work with. But again, there's this very interesting role that we play of pushing the dialogue, asking the ministers to be involved, but not necessarily being in government spaces for that dialogue. The final thing I would say is that's actually one of the things we have been pushing for as a regional CTF. Can we help with the independent role of telling the stories of what's possible, both at the national level and the regional level? And will the government allow a discussion point that is beyond governments and speaks more to regional governance and cooperation with an entity like the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, which is, as a conservation trust fund, designed to be in for the long haul and not project based, and really can be at the table alongside some of those partners. I hope that answered.
It certainly got us into, we could dig a lot deeper into a lot of these things. It starts as always. But we're gonna go around to all our speakers first and then come back into these specific strands. So moving on to me, in Micronesia, we see a slightly different stage of evolution where the conservation movement that began with the MCT is now generating new institutional innovations that you're at the forefront of. So we have Ecofin Micronesia, which is just focusing on strengthening institutional financial judgment across conservation finance institutions and other institutions in general. So my question is, what problem was Ecofin designed to solve that traditional technical assistance was not addressing?
Sure, thank you. I think the first one is that it was intermittent. Training was quite intermittent, and it had to cover, if you had a traditional workshop or technical assistance training, it took into consideration multiple needs and tried to train everybody up at the same time. And it wasn't very tailor-made. In addition to that, you have knowledge holders, if you will, or the experts coming in, flying in to do the training, and then leaving. So oftentimes the learning didn't reside because you need constant and continuous follow-up. The purpose and what sort of got MCT to start thinking more deeply into ensuring that there was good financial literacy, not just to the folks that we were re-granting to, but actually to institutions that could support MCT in the re-granting process. And it made me think of a question that the Angelique had asked a while ago about establishing the Western Indian Ocean Trust, and how do one trust fund amongst many other trust funds, is that a potential for vying for the same pockets of money? How do you widely disperse? How do you find niche within this space and ensure that you're not competing with others? So I kind of had that in mind at first when we were thinking about EcoFin, but mostly it was, how do we use other financing institutions within Micronesia as partners to also reduce our administrative costs, but build their capacity as well. And the situation that presented itself was a GCF project that we're rolling out right now, which is to actually help two of our local funding mechanisms, the Palau Pan Fund and the MIMRA Fund. So MIMRA is a fisheries agency that also disperses finances to communities. And the idea was, how do we create a small grants facility within each of those dispersal entities who do currently disperse the Micronesia Challenge endowment monies in their own countries, but build their capacity to also create a facility outside of the protected areas network system. And the first thing was, do they have the technical systems in place? Do they have the appropriate capacity in place and the reporting frameworks needed outside of what they were legislatively created to do initially? And then how do we fast track learning? Because we can't send somebody to go back to school and wait for them for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to get the learning done. So we borrowed from a really great and still very relevant paper done by Audrey Newman on catalytic capacity building, and adopted that learning framework to create EcoFin. And the idea is it's very targeted needs. It's a small group. It will consist of, for now, MCT, Palau Pan Fund, and MIMRA. Those are the first initial core entity groups to actually build their small grants facilities, as well as looking at the policies and legislation that governs them. And then in addition to that, while we're not going to help them currently get accreditation to the GCF, but they're very, very close, because we have to pass on all the processes and procedures and rules around GCF to the entities who are going to support us in mobilizing these funds to the community. It helps keep MCT very streamlined. We don't have to grow too big. We're utilizing other funding mechanisms. We're spreading the wealth, so to speak, and it doesn't look like MCT becomes the only recipient of funds, but we're actually working with the entities that know the situation on the ground. MCT is based here in the FSM and actually based strategically in Pohnpei. We have one staff outside of Pohnpei. So how do we broaden our reach without having large administrative costs? So we were looking internally within what we needed support with. but in addition to that, building the capacity of our partners who are on the ground.
That's awesome. I love that. Um, so we're gonna dig into that as well. But
Sure.
lastly, let's move on to Angelique, to the Western Indian Ocean region, and where we're seeing something particularly interesting, the early design of a regional conservation trust fund. So my question for you, Angelique, is what key lessons from the other regions are informing the design of this fund, and what governance choices feels most critical at this early stage?
Thanks, Jabal. And it's it's a great question given in designing and considering how to design this conservation trust fund. We were able to speak to both Karen and May to see what learnings we could draw from the experience of MCT as well as CBF. So in terms of the lessons we're drawing from the two, first it's really that political targets. Both MCT and CBF, talked about the challenge that sort of uh, provided the impetus to look at a regional approach. So one of the things that's been very interesting for the Western Indian Ocean, back in whenever it was, I think, the first UN conference where there were these voluntary commitments. The Western Seychelles initiated this idea of having a Western Indian Ocean challenge. And very similar to to that of both other regions, but it never materialized in the same way, or it didn't take off in the same way, presumably uh, presumably because of the different actors in play in the region. And now it's really interesting because time has moved on. We now see that all countries have I mean, essentially agreed to 30 by 30, using it very colloquially, but the target in the Kunming Montreal biodiversity framework. And now we see an opportunity to either use that as the impetus, but more importantly, perhaps reinvigorate the Western Indian Ocean Challenge. And one of the things that we also discussed, and May already highlighted this, around this idea of competition and what's the niche. So we've had the opportunity to also socialize the idea of this regional conservation trust fund very much with this, what is the niche? And feedback we've received so far is that, one, there's a lot going on in the Western Indian Ocean as it relates to quote unquote blue finance. The EU is funding a big project that will essentially become a blue finance platform for the Western Indian Ocean, where multiple initiatives are emerging. So it's been agreed that the Regional Conservation Trust Fund will be quite targeted in being very focused on conservation, although the definition of conservation more aligned with KMBGF, the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework. So a broader understanding than just sort of the purest way of looking at conservation, and with a view that with sorry, with a view that we then focus on transboundary protected areas. So looking at things that countries would need to collaborate on, as opposed to things that would be funded through individual, or necessarily would be funded through individual jurisdictions. So that's something else that has emerged from our learnings from other RCTF, but also from what we're looking at for the Western Indian Ocean. I think the other thing that's been very interesting is this capacity piece, and we are trying to see how to build capacity in the region to begin with on sustainable finance, because that's something that is actually a real challenge. And so we're looking at this very long term. So although Admittedly, we did get donor support to undertake this work. We're not doing it let's say we're not doing it the fast way. There was definitely a faster way of doing this. We've decided that we're going to have a very strong capacity building element by having national level research undertaken by master's or PhD students. And YOMSA is providing these research grants to, I think it's about 11 countries in the Western Indian Ocean to support students to be able to undertake research, which will then feed up into the design of the RCTF. So those are, I think, three elements that we took away, having the political impetus, thinking through being niche, adding value, working with others, and then the sustained capacity piece. In terms of where are we leaning in terms of design, that part is still very much in the works. We have done an analysis of potential host countries, looking at governance and financing landscape. So now there's about 4 countries that are, somewhat shortlisted as potential hosts for the Regional Conservation Trust Fund. But one of the things that we also learned, particularly from the other regional conservation trust funds, is around the operational work that needs to be thought through as well. And one of the things that we're looking at is getting early support to think about this operationalization, including not leaving it up to YOMSA to be the one to, you know, undertake all of this, right? It's really about getting some political buy-in from high level, but then making sure that we're thinking through, operational documents, staffing, and all that kind of thing. So the next step is we intend to present how far we've reached, including with the research of the students, to the Nairobi Convention COP in October of this year. Thanks, Joel.
Awesome. No problem. And yeah, thanks for that. I love like the common threads that you and me have in terms of capacity building and how you plan to approach that with the niche and using what you have in region. I think that's really interesting, and we're already seeing these parallels coming out. Um, and now that we've had your opening interventions, I think for the next part of our panel discussion, I want to explore these general themes among your work and get your individual perspectives on this and how they connect and maybe differ according to your context. Um, so there's a lot of general themes, I would say, in terms of the challenges that there are in sustaining regional initiatives, like maintaining the political leadership, securing the long-term financing, institutional coordination. I think that came out very strongly in what May had to say and you as well, Angelique. And of course Karen too, of course. Demonstrating impact and things like governance and accountability. So I think how we're going to try and do this is I'm going to ask throw out some general questions on these challenges, and let's see how y'all respond. And it's more meant of like a free-flowing debate. Y'all can piggyback on each other and what you all have to say. I will try and be on the sidelines as unintrusive as possible while you all hash it out. I mean, this is easier to do in real life, but let's see how it occurs in a Zoom meeting. So you could all unmute yourselves at the same time, maybe. So I think my first question will be around political leadership and institutional independence, because Karen spoke about that a bit in terms of the sort of part that CBF is trying to manage in terms of how they get a seat with the government while still being independent. Um, so many regional initiatives are starting with these strong political momentum, but political cycles, as we all know, shift. So how do we maintain political alignment without becoming overly dependent on political leadership? How important is institutional independence and what governance structures help? There's a chance as well for my other panelists to maybe give some advice to Angelique in terms of how they go with their regional conservation trust fund. And give some advice on how she said they're still very broad in terms of what they're going to do exactly. So y'all could give some advice to her on this as well. So we'll start with Karen.
From the starting point. So I think there are two things that come to mind. One is really trying to figure out the regional partners that are at play in any discussion that you may be having on conservation management in the region. In the Caribbean region, there is a climate change unit, etc. There are other major partners and players, and just making sure that you are aware, and to be honest, to use again the phrase at the table when these discussions are happening, to promote the idea of the role that conservation trust funds can play. There is an interesting quirk in the Caribbean region, which might be of interest to Angelique in particular, which is that we then created these national level conservation trust funds, which are created as independent entities in and of themselves. After we've set them up, they receive money from us, but their connection to us is then different. They are very much allowed to give grants where they can and report to us. And that has created some of what May mentioned in terms of, are we competing? How do we make sure and explain our national roles versus our regional roles, and what are those, and how are we fencing those? If four of the national conservation trust funds decided to work together on an initiative, should that be through CBF or should it not? Very, very interesting discussions, and quite frankly, the same at the national levels. For the most part in the Caribbean region, I think it is still a matter of working together in any multi-country setting does need some support, and CBF has been able to offer that because we have strong technical information and technical knowledge on what's happening across the region. And I think that's a big part of why we've been able to play that role. I think those were the first points. I'll come back if I remember. There was one more, but I'll come back if I remember it. So please, I'm happy to open the floor.
Who wants to jump in? Yeah, you could go ahead.
So I wanted to comment first on what Angelique was saying about focusing on capacity building. And it'd be great also to get Trina's perspective, because she was part of the design and setup of the Micronesia Challenge, and most definitely in its implementation and rollout. But something that existed before the Micronesia Challenge was the Micronesians and Island Conservation, which was very much focused on catalytic capacity building. And the idea was, how do you grow leadership in both the government and the NGO space, but have them talking to each other on mutual goals and ideas around conservation? And then and this was regional. This wasn't just focused on one country. It was a regional focus, and it was building that capacity, building cohesion. And through that cohesive building, it was also looking at goals. The first was conservation goals at home and institutional goals. And then they thought, what is it that we can work around as a regional goal? And that discussion was actually happening prior to the Micronesia Challenge. And then we had one champion leader, super charismatic, that said, I want to make a big splash at the next biodiversity convention. And that was President Tommy Romengesau. And because you already had a network of people working on designing a regional goal, you had this champion president at the highest level, who then got the rest of the chief executives across Micronesia. And to this day, 23 changes of executive leadership, we are about to hit 20 years. MIC is about to hit 25 years. MCT is about to hit 25 years. But again, it started with capacity building and bringing the folks that were getting the work done on the ground already talking to each other and already building partnership and coalition. Trina, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think May did a great job. That was so eloquent. And I think it also ties to some of the other comments from Karen and Angelique that the leaders were confident to make this big, bold commitment because they knew the foundation was there. They knew that they checked in with their folks on the ground and they're like, yeah, we're working towards these types of goals already. Communities are working on protected areas and working on effective management. And so I think it was a nice virtual cycle of, yeah, we can go bigger and bolder because we know we have a solid foundation, and then we can help make that go even broader and more to scale. The only thing else I would add is I think what's key about having gone through so many elected leadership changes is always having a champion at the leader level so that, as like when President Ramengesau was no longer president, we had Governor Camacho from Guam, where we had President Mori like different people stepping up and going, no, we still want to do this. We still want to do this. So even if a new leader came in and was a little skeptical, their peers were the ones that said, no, 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 this is really good. We still want to do this. So just stop there.
Angelica, I'll let you come in to respond, and then Kate, I see your hand is raised. Kate, you come in after.
No, thanks for all those insights. I think it's very helpful, and certainly one of the reflections I had as everyone spoke was around how the actors who supported getting the 30% in Seychelles uh, ensured that during the conversation, they always included members of the opposition, for example, and being aware of all the developments. So when there was government or administration change, those who were in the opposition before were now in power, but they had already had buy-in because they were part of that process. They had already been socialized. On that. So that's a very I think that resonated with me a lot based on the Seychelles experience. I think the other interesting thing about political considerations, one of the things that we heard from May and Karen was also around who sits on your board and the governance structure. And I think that is going to be another really interesting piece of the puzzle when it comes to designing board composition and thinking and it's I think to Trina's point, you also want to insulate the board, right? When I say insulate, I mean you also want to make sure that you've got champions regardless of changes in political administrations in different countries. So that was very helpful. Thanks.
Thank you all. Kate.
I was just going to say, I think what May is really pointing to, and probably also you, Angelique, is it's less about what you're doing, but more about how you go about doing it. Because a lot of so how we see with Micronesia is really about relationships and deep ones across and upwards. So you're not relying on one or two people to kind of lift things or to know or to trust each other as you move forward in a space that isn't necessarily comfortable. I think probably out of all of us on here have probably been involved with all of these things in different ways. And so if we look at the Caribbean, it has not had the same political engagement for a range of reasons, and um, I think has suffered a little bit for that. Even though Karen, you actually have mobilized more resources, it's more the implementation and ownership side of things that I think has been more of a struggle in your region. But I think it's like navigating to what makes sense kind of where you are. I think that we shouldn't, you know, I think we shouldn't forget the idea of this peer-to-peer space and how, while you're doing things either at an island level or a regional level, how your other peers from other regions, etc. Because I think that's part of why Micronesia Challenge has continued because other islands have been other people have basically said, this is really amazing what you've done. And it kind of makes it a thing rather than being kind of just the people in those places trying to lift it. So I think as we move forward, thinking, how we, this group and more broadly collectively, can find those ways to anchor some of these things over time, without leaving it just to the individual national or regional trust funds to do. And I think that's part of the reason why we're on this call. And the other thing I want to reflect on, so um, I think you've got a really complicated region, to be honest, Angelique, because we did a lot of work on the early Western Indian Ocean Challenge, and just the governance across different treaties and stuff is just a bit mind-bogglingly complicated. And that I think will be a challenge, and maybe this trust fund will help um, in a very practical way, not solve those problems, but help people find a way to work together on something that feels tangible and where they can see an impact, and that hopefully can also continue to mobilize the political leadership. But so last week, 2 weeks ago, we were in Fiji, actually, with half of the people on this call, at the Pacific Ocean Finance Week. And actually, a large chunk of Pacific Ocean Finance Week was focused on conservation trust funds, um, and the different elements and the different ways. So when the reports and stuff comes out of that, we'll share that with everyone because there was Micronesia, Caribbean, corals one from Niue, the Coral Triangle one, which is another regional one that's trying to get going, and I think it's not as advanced as you actually, I perceive. But there's a few, and then there's a lot of national trust funds. One of the things that we see coming out of the Bezos Earth Fund, Unlocking Blue Pacific Prosperity, is a desire by some of the early grantees to develop conservation trust funds. And I think one of the things we were really sort of saying in that week is to really rethink what the Pacific's ocean finance architecture looks like, for now, rather than just everyone doing things all over the place and that sort of thing. So there may be actually things that the Pacific region can learn from what you're doing, Angelique, and also CBF, I think. So this is really exciting, exciting conversation.
Thank you, Kate. Um, my next two general questions were around the role of trust funds beyond simply financing and also on partnerships. But I feel like a lot of your answers from all the panelists sort of bled into that already. So I want to move on to something I feel that hasn't been touched on as much yet, which is measuring impact. I think many regional initiatives struggle to demonstrate impact beyond the funds mobilized. So how do we define success among these initiatives? Whether it be around, well, 30 by 30 is the ecological outcome, but around things like institutional capacity and policy influence. Just throwing that out there. What do you guys think?
If I can respond first, as the one sort of in a very exploratory stage and had a very, very, very lengthy conversations about, what is success, and what does it look like. So I think Kate is absolutely right that the Western Indian Ocean is a complicated region in that the countries, I mean, obviously it's not just SIDS, right? So you've got these large mainland African countries on the east coast of the continent that have very different socioeconomic characteristics to small island developing states who are neighbors of these countries. And when we define success, and there was a lot of tug of war in terms of trying to figure out how we even define, should we even use the word conservation trust fund, and conservation being the not problematic word, but the word that may need to be reconsidered. And that was because the connotations that it may have around being a trade-off, being a zero-sum game, if you like, as it relates to other socioeconomic challenges. And that's something that's going to be a very live consideration. So that's why we pivoted to not focusing just on the 30 by 30 target of the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework, but to think about all the other elements around sustainable livelihoods, and other elements. So what does success look like? I think even, and from my experience with SACAT coming up with an MNE framework, it's going to have to look quite different. I think we're going to have to think about how many jobs created type of approaches, in addition to your ecological 30 by 30 approach. So that's a difficult but very live conversation for the Western Indian Ocean because of the characteristic of that region. But not inherently so, right? I don't think that it's unique to the Western Indian Ocean.
Who wants
Yeah,
to
maybe
jump in next?
I'll jump in and add a couple of things. First is really to guide everyone, if they have not seen the work that's been done on conservation trust funds globally by CFA, Conservation Finance Alliance, which really starts to analyze the role of conservation trust funds and the approach to them, including this idea of monitoring, which really has come almost secondary in the discussions of the CTFs, those who have been around for a while, because the idea, and I've asked this question of my board very directly, if I get you all the money that you want for the region and give these projects out, because I don't implement, I give projects out, have I been successful if none of them gets us to 30 by 30, or if we're nowhere, if I've cleaned all the beaches and nothing more? And it is a hard question. So in developing our indicators, we really have money. We need to have money. How much money do we have? Are we managing it well? And then have we had impact in impact being capacity development at the organizational level, the country level, and the people level? And then we do have some very broad, are we making global impact, which is, have we made an impact on the range of global indicators, which for us are range from climate change to biodiversity. So it is a hard question, and the work that was done by CFA also has that as a point of interest. One is our financial role, but also how do we then report on the storytelling and the successes we've had in making an impact. So it has been something we've been trying to figure out and put some data and figures to. The other thing is a discussion on necessarily on the role of regional funds, which actually just in a discussion today with a gentleman from South Africa who wants to do basically an umbrella fund for a range of small local marine managed areas. So they would all have CTFs, and then there would be one regional fund, partly for the economy of scale. So the same concept that we have, that we will do the umbrella fund will do the major fundraising, and then the management units can do their core work, which is implementation and results on the ground. So also to really think the idea through of that umbrella role that regional funds play in terms of bringing donors around the table, bringing donors into a discussion in a way that I think we haven't had before, and I think it's an important place we can hold. Now, for now, it's at the national level, but I will say that discussion today was really interesting on an umbrella MPA discussion for for the Caribbean region that CBF would hold as well. So we wouldn't have a national conservation trust fund, we would have an MPA conservation trust fund that would think solely about MPA management. So again, it's growing and expanding by the minute, but a lot of interesting conversations indeed on how we can think about that regional role.
Me, I think you're up.
Sure. I think that besides this being very complex, a couple of things. If we were to measure success as far as conservation trust funds, I think it's looking at those like the CBF, MCT, CTCF, the Coral Triangle Initiative, and looking at where they are in maturity and the types of questions they are currently asking versus when they first began. I think that's really critical because it's not always measured in, as you put it, Karen, when you ask the question to the board, if I did all of this and funded all of this, is that truly a benchmark of success? And I would say, what have we graduated to? Right now, if you had asked MCT when it first began, at its genesis, the CBF, even Coral, despite the initiative being quite new, I think the first thing they would be saying is, what do we need to teach ourselves? What is it that we have to learn right now to do conservation trust funds properly, to manage money well? And I think a few of us have graduated. We know the mechanics of it. We get the mechanics of it. But the next piece to that, and I asked this question in the 2-pager that I sent everybody, I think the question is, how are we responding under pressure? We've had multiple. We had the loss of USAID. I don't know how big of a hit everybody took. MCT had a pretty decent one. If you look at though, GLISPA is not a CTF, but heavily relies on us to support her. That was a major hit to her. Now, if we look at the endowments that we are currently managing and what this current war and what took place under COVID and all this other stuff, and the direction that now politics in the more developed and Western community, what they're driving as far as what they're willing to put money towards. In our infancy, we all would have reacted so much more different. We would have been checking the ticker symbols every single day to look at how terribly our endowments were behaving. I tell you now, though tempted, I know not to look, I know to wait. And I think that's important. That is a measure of our maturity. The next piece is how well we can communicate that. Those of us who've been around for the last 20 years, how we can communicate that to Niue Ocean-wide, how we communicate that to Angelique when the WIO Conservation Trust Fund comes along. That is extremely important. And then how we communicate that to our governments who are sitting there freaking out, watching their monies take a tank while they continue to be told, please continue to invest in your endowment because it's worth it, it's worth it, it's worth it. And this was the other thing that we hope that EcoFin will address is, again, financial literacy and also understanding how economies work. They fluctuate, they go up and down, but the trust fund mechanism does work. I think the other thing that we should measure is how well our current absorptive capacity increases, and then how well those we fund, their absorptive capacity on finance also increases. So as we're growing, they grow in strength as well, and making sure that we have new players coming to the table who are ready to receive funds at community level. This was the whole point of the GCF, and this is the whole point of conservation trust funds. We hold the money, we grow the money until communities And municipal governments are ready and able to not just access, but manage those effectively. And if they cannot do it, we hold it for a while until they are ready. We need to start measuring that part. It's up to the Coral Triangle Initiative, it's up to the Caribbean Initiative, it's up to the Micronesia Challenge Initiative to measure how conservation is hitting the appropriate targets that we committed to under the GBF, under the UNFCCC. I think our measurement indicators are a little bit different. Yes, we want to know how effective every dollar translates in its capacity to get to the ground and do the work. But so tracking is critical, but it's mostly, and Karen, you pointed to this, how are we elevating capacity of those around us to be effective recipients? And I do want to address a little bit, because there has been some talk in the Micronesia region about the countries managing their own trust funds, not necessarily MCT or the Micronesia Challenge Endowment being the holder of that. And there is a little bit of, right? You kind of suck in the breath and go, wait a second, then what is my relevance? But I think, Angelique, you pointed to something, and Karen, you really fleshed this out. We have different roles and different spaces to play. MCT has been around for 20 years or almost 25 years. And as a result, we are seen as a trusted entity. Secondly, those trust funds that they want to create per country, they are different because they will be government seated, government appointed, and government legislated. They are not that flexible. We are. Those of us who are not built because of a government legislation, policy, or rule, we don't have the same mandate. We can move. We have dexterity within our space. And again, we have been talking this space for a very long time. The donors trust us. And my thing is, how do we prepare for that? If the countries go in this direction, how do we prepare? And I think I said this to Angelique, you use them as dispersal mechanisms and this is already what you're doing, Karen. And I think that's, instead of being fearful of competition, I think what we do is prepare ourselves if that becomes an eventuality. And that, again, another measure and benchmark of success for MCT, and I would hazard to say other CTFs.
Thanks, me. I feel like you wrapped it up for everyone here. And like even what this whole alliance is about, really, you captured that. So we are at the hour mark, but I really want to push on if we could have maybe 5 to 10 more minutes. And I really wanted to give a chance for those participants to maybe have some reflections. I see some usual suspects on the call. There's Trina, there's Coral. We have a new person, Ron. So I just want to give it some space for if you all have any reflections or questions you want to pose to the panel.
I guess I can jump in. I guess sorry, Coral, did you come up? You should go.
No, you go ahead, Trina. That's fine.
Okay. I guess I would just also think there might also be a role. I totally agree with everything May and Karen and Angelique have said about like there can be competition, but I think there's also a little bit of a role in helping country partners understand when it makes sense for them to set up a new fund and when it maybe doesn't make sense. You know, these are small places that can't always, you know, the economy of scale isn't there. Like you can make more money if you have more money. So think about when it makes sense and when it maybe doesn't make sense. And so that's the only thing I would add is just I think you all have such an incredible knowledge, expertise, and skills to share with our country partners. So it's finding that balance of using those relationships and being honest while still also recognizing there's much work to go around and there is no reason to fear competition or anything like that. So thank you. It's a wonderful panel. Thank you.
So thanks. I might just add real quick on the back of that, Jabal. So I always love listening to all of these ladies and experts across SIDS regions. I think it's just such a wealth of applied science and experience that I wish more people had the opportunity to learn from. And so all of the points that were raised around transcending government tenure, I think are really important. The public-private partnership element of that, I think, is quite key. The consistency of the little engines that sit underneath that leadership, I think is really important, and that it is definitely anchored in and driven by country representatives themselves rather than what is often, I mean, some of the biggest failures I've seen in our region at least have been because they were driven by external stakeholders, big bingos who didn't have a bad intention at all. They just came in over top of, took advantage of some very outstanding leaders who were in place for a short time, but didn't have the underpinning of the consistency that is needed to transcend government tenure and to stay really anchored in the realities of our communities who need to feed themselves at the end of the day. So you can't just lock up assets and not have a plan, right? That's going to address that challenge. I think maybe the only other thing that I would add is that we have to proactively engage the extractive sectors when we're talking about conservation. We simply cannot get governments to sign on to conservation in a 30 by 30 without understanding the implications that has on what is normally the largest natural assets that governments of small island states have to draw on. And so actually embracing that at the outset gives the conservation narrative a much stronger future holding in longevity, in my view. And we learned that through going through the real cost benefit analysis. How would we make sure that the conservation area would actually reinforce the long-term economic development of the country, its resilience, as well as being ocean positive forever. So I think my final point might be around just really recognizing those important points on measuring success. And I think again, this is where we really need to have to measure success from the perspective of small island developing states with large ocean assets, but who are on the front lines of the impact of climate change. Because the narrative of success from that lens is extremely different from the narrative of success from a global lens on climate change and biodiversity. So I look at it this way. In simple views from the Pacific, but I think we could extrapolate this across SIDS regions. As a small island developing state, blue continent, if we all agreed to 30 by 30, we would be protecting about 9 million square kilometers of the largest natural endowment on the planet. If we extrapolated that out to all SIDS 30 by 30 blue real estate, it would be even bigger. Now, as a contribution to planetary and climate stability, that is beyond any amount of finance we are asking for climate change, biodiversity protection, conservation protection, etc. I think it's all about putting into perspective that contribution that small island states make to planetary stability, whilst asking for really what is a drop in the bucket to help them maintain that and build a resilient blue economy that's going to ensure that people don't have to move country or move village without security. So I always feel like we undersell the value of conservation because we don't truly appreciate those natural assets and their total value. We look at them just as carbon or just as a biodiversity, but in fact, they are all those things. And as the global environment is decreasing in its health, these natural capital endowments that we are protecting are increasing significantly in value. We just haven't monetized that in a way that is fair. And I think we've got some really great big opportunities this year with COP31 that's spotlighting on the Pacific. The Pacific collectively have a very big contribution in this space already at leaders level. in the 30 by 30. But imagine if we extrapolated that out to all of the SIDS regions and calculated that total 30 by 30 asset if all the SIDS have contributed to, have agreed to that as well. That is a very big statement of SIDS contributions that can sort of help us leverage the type of finance and recognition of the role that these communities and countries are making in this context. Yeah, sorry, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Coral. We're 5 minutes over, so to paraphrase Karen, I think I'll just give an opportunity for our Sid Queens on the panel to do some final takeaways, and then I think we could wrap up.
Sure, I can start just to say a wonderful discussion that has to continue. I think just to reflect on Coral's last words, that is definitely direction we should be heading in, really asking and demanding the space that SIDS needs to have the discussions on our value. Not an easy one, but definitely one that we should continue to push for and to show the examples that we already have in terms of successes and what can be done. Glad to be here and glad to share any other lessons I can as we go along. Thank you.
I'll go next. Yeah, Coral, as usual, it's kind of hard to follow you after you say and present because they are not pearls and nuggets of wisdom. It's just a lot. I'm a big fan. I think that is, you're absolutely right. I remember we were doing it at very small scale. The idea of what does it cost one to breathe, right? The value of every tree, what does that cost? I remember sitting on a panel actually with one of your, I'm assuming, well, it might predate you, but it was a woman also looking at the Western Indian Ocean, and back when they were looking at it, just at the genesis of the conversation. And someone asked me, can we eat biodiversity? Because why are we protecting this? I want to know if I can eat it. And the fact is you can't, because you lose it, you lose your food systems. And I think if we can just speak to that more and broaden that biodiversity, again, we keep talking about the BB&J. So let's make sure that we let people know absolutely it is the air you breathe all the way out beyond our boundaries. It is the food that you eat. And not only that, we are the systems that ensure that the rest of the planet gets it as well. So, yes, we don't talk about it enough. And I think it's about time we are a little bit more vocal.
Um, I'll just say thanks for a very inspiring conversation, and always great to learn from this group, panelists and audience. And I think I'll just sort of marry what is top of mind in my mind, but always comes up in conversations whenever I've presented on the RCTF, which is is there a role for the RCTF when it comes to BB&J? And this is something that a piece of work that I supported Wyomsa on a couple of years ago was around what does 30 by 30 look like for the Western Indian Ocean, including areas beyond national jurisdiction. And now this is sort of coming together with thinking about this transboundary protected area, and transboundary being more than national jurisdiction to the next national jurisdiction, but also to areas beyond national jurisdiction. So I'll end it there just to say extremely inspired as always with this group, and hope to take some of that fire to the PrepCom negotiation rooms and remind everyone about, just how much we are doing on our own tax dollar for a global service.
Thanks so much, guys. A big thank you to our panel. I really appreciate you guys. Thanks for doing this. You make moderation very easy. I think the time just flew by. Um, Thank you for all those who were able to join the call today. It's been recorded, so we'll be sending that out. The resources from today's session will be reshared as well, and then there were some new ones that came in the chat, so I will be sure to send that in the email. And we look forward to just continue building and continuing the conversation in future sessions. So thank you, everyone, and God bless and have a great night or morning or rest of your day where you are.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Everybody.
guys.